In 1980, 4 young nuns from the small parish of Eldon Hollow in Northern California vanished without a trace, leaving behind a community shattered by grief and haunted by endless questions. The autumn of that year painted the redwood coast in hues of gold and russet, but a stark, unseasonable chill settled over the devout and tightly knit community of Eldon Hollow. It wasn't the usual coastal fog, nor the biting wind that swept through the eaves of St. Agnes Catholic Church. It was the absence of 4 of their own, 4 women of God who had simply disappeared. Sister Agnes Peltier, 67, whose hands were forever clasped in gentle prayer, and whose wisdom comforted many. Sister Beatrice Moreau, 62, whose hearty laughter once filled the church halls, and whose baking was the stuff of local legend. Sister Claire Dubois, youthful and bright at 27, her spirit eager like the morning sun, newly vowed to her sacred calling. And Sister Seraphina Vance, barely 22, whose angelic voice seemed to carry a direct line to the heaven sand, who was the beloved younger sister of Father Michael Vance. They had embarked on a 3-day spiritual retreat to St. Jude's, a secluded chapel nestled deep within the sprawling ancient redwood forest bordering Eldon Hollow. Chosen for its profound silence and remoteness, it was said to be a place where one could hear the voice of God more clearly. They were expected back on a Tuesday, but when Wednesday dawned with no sign of them, a knot of unease tightened the town's collective stomach. Father Michael, then a newly ordained priest serving his first parish miles away but visiting his sister and hometown, was the one who had waved them off. Seraphina, her face alight with devotion and a touch of adventure, had squeezed his hand. "Pray for us, Michael," she whispered, eyes sparkling. "This is important." He promised he would, though a flicker of apprehension stirred within him. The woods surrounding St. Jude's were vast and untamed. By Wednesday afternoon, apprehension blossomed into full-blown fear. Sheriff Brody, a man accustomed to minor disputes and the occasional lost hiker, organized the first search party. Father Michael, his clerical collar tightening like a noose, was among the first to volunteer, his heart pounding wildly. The narrow dirt track to St. Jude's was slick from recent rains. The chapel, a simple wooden structure with a faded white facade and a silent bell tower, stood eerily empty. Their modest vehicle, an old station wagon donated to the convent, was parked where they'd left it, keys in the ignition as if they'd merely stepped away. Inside, prayer books lay open on rough-hewn pews. A half-eaten apple sat on a table in the sacristy. A single unlit candle stood before the altar. No signs of struggle, forced entry, or notes. It was as if the 4 women had dissolved into the damp, earthy scent of the redwoods. The search initially focused around the chapel. Volunteers called the sisters names, their voices swallowed by immense indifferent trees. The forest, floor thick with fallen needles and decaying leaves, offered no clues, no dropped rosaries, no torn fabric, no footprints clear enough to follow. The air grew colder as dusk fell, the shadows of colossal redwoods stretching like grasping fingers. Driven by desperate energy, Father Michael pushed himself harder than anyone. He scrambled down ravines, his black trousers torn by thorns, his hands raw. He peered into hollow logs and dense thickets, prayers frantic beneath his breath. "Seraphina! Sister Agnes! Beatrice! Claire!" His hoarse, cracking voice echoed mockingly back. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig sent adrenaline surging, only to be crushed by despair. Days bled into a week. Search parties grew larger, bolstered by volunteers and trackers. Dogs were brought in, their eager barks kindling fleeting hope, but their trails ended abruptly, as if the nuns had vanished into thin air. The Eldon Hollow Chronicle ran desperate headlines. The community gathered nightly at St. Agnes, prayers growing fervent, faces etched with worry. Theories circulated. Sudden illness? Unlikely all 4 at once. Animal attack? The redwoods housed bears and mountain lions, but the lack of physical evidence, no blood, no torn clothing, no remains made, this improbable. Sheriff Brody, increasingly frustrated, confessed to Father Michael one evening, "It's like they vanished into thin air. No trace, nothing. I've never seen anything like it." Whispers surfaced more insidious than comforting, suggesting they'd run away or abandoned their vows. Father Michael recoiled, fury rising. Seraphina was the most devout soul he knew. The others shared unshakable faith. Such claims were slanderous, but the mystery's impossibility fueled them. Nearly 2 weeks into the search, a volunteer found a small, crudely carved wooden bird tucked into a crevice miles from the chapel in an unexpected direction. It was the kind Sister Agnes often made during quiet reflection. Father Michael's heart leapt, then sank. The fragile clue led nowhere. The area was scoured with no further sign. A signora cruel coincidence? After 3 weeks, the official search was scaled back, then called off as winter rains threatened to wash away all traces. The case remained open, filed under missing persons, a cold label for such a deeply personal tragedy. For Father Michael, the end of the search was no end at all. It marked the beginning of a solitary, agonizing vigil. Returning to his parish, his duties felt hollow, sermons flat, prayers unanswered. The faces of his congregation blurred, replaced by the image of Serafina's smiling face as she waved goodbye. He had nurtured her faith since childhood. Had he led her to this fate? The question tormented him endlessly. The woods around St. Jude's, once serene, had become a nightmare landscape. He dreamed of his sister, lost and frightened, her hand outstretched and eyes pleading. He awoke, gasping, the scent of pine needles and damp earth clinging to him, suffocated by helplessness. Eldon Hollow mourned in silence. Memorials were held, but no graves existed to visit. The absence of closure was a wound that festered, a grief without a resting place. St. Perfax, Jude's chapel, once a place of peace, fell into disuse, a mournful sentinel in the whispering woods, forever tied to the mystery of the 4 vanished nuns. For Father Michael, it was the epicenter of sorrow, a place he dared not visit, yet which haunted his waking moments and troubled dreams. The silence of the woods kept its secrets tightly, and the shadow of that mystery, like the towering redwoods, stretched long and dark over Eldon Hollow, deepening with time. The community of Havenwood mourned, each in their own way. Memorial services were held, but there were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. The absence of closure was a wound that refused to heal, festering with unanswered questions and a grief that had no focal point. The chapel of St. Jude's, once a place of quiet contemplation, fell into disuse, a silent, mournful sentinel in the whispering woods, forever associated with the mystery of the 4 vanished nuns. For Father Michael, it was the epicenter of his sorrow, a place he couldn't bear to visit, yet a place that haunted his every waking moment and stalked his troubled sleep. The silence of the woods held its secrets tight, and the mystery, like the towering redwoods, cast a long, dark shadow over Havenwood, a shadow that time seemed only to deepen. Years bled into a decade, then 2. The vibrant hues of grief in Havenwood slowly faded to the muted tones of resigned sorrow, a permanent scar etched onto the town's collective soul. The disappearance of the 4 nuns became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children, a somber anniversary marked by dwindling congregations at St. Michael's Parish. The Redwood Coast, with its mists and ancient forests, seemed to have swallowed them whole, leaving behind only an aching void and a host of unanswered questions. Father Michael Vance aged, the lines on his face deepening not just with time, but with the unrelenting weight of his private torment. He had eventually been reassigned to St. Michael's in Havenwood, a move that was both a comfort and a curse. He was home, among familiar faces who understood, at least in part, the depth of his loss. But he was also tethered to the epicenter of his pain, the constant, silent reminder of Serafina's absence. Every tall redwood he passed, every gust of wind sighing through the pines, seemed to whisper her name. His faith, once a bedrock, had become a complicated terrain. He performed his priestly duties with diligence, his voice steady during Mass, his counsel sought by parishioners navigating their own smaller sorrows. Yet, in the quiet solitude of the rectory, doubt was a frequent, unwelcome visitor. He'd prayed relentlessly in those early years. Prayers for Serafina's safe return, prayers for answers, prayers for solace. The silence from the heavens had been deafening. He wrestled with theodicy, the age-old question of why a benevolent God would allow such suffering, such inexplicable evil, to touch those who had dedicated their lives to him. His theological texts offered complex arguments, but they felt like cold, intellectual exercises against the raw, visceral grief that still ambushed him at unexpected moments. The case of the missing nuns remained open but dormant, a dusty file in the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody had long since retired, replaced by a younger man who knew the story only as local folklore. Periodically, a new detective, fresh-faced and eager, might pull the file, intrigued by its baffling nature. They would reread the sparse reports, the fruitless interviews, the maps of the search areas. They might even drive out to the crumbling, overgrown track leading towards St. Jude's, stare into the impenetrable woods, and then, like so many before them, shake their heads and return the file to its shelf. There were no new leads, no fresh perspectives, nothing to reignite an investigation that had burned itself out decades ago. The theories, too, had calcified. The bear attack theory, though officially discounted due to lack of evidence, still held sway with some. Others clung to the idea that the nuns had simply wandered off, lost their way in the vastness of the forest, and succumbed to the elements, their remains undiscovered. The more cynical, or perhaps the more imaginative, still whispered about them running away, starting new lives under different names, a fantasy that offered a kind of closure, however improbable. Father Michael dismissed these thoughts with a weary sigh. He knew Serafina. He knew her heart. He kept a small, framed photograph of Serafina on his desk, not the formal portrait from her vows, but a candid snapshot taken a summer before she disappeared. She was laughing, her head thrown back, sunlight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. Her joy was so palpable, so alive, that it was a daily stab to his heart. Beside it, he kept the last known photograph of all 4 nuns, taken by a hiker just days before their retreat, outside St. Jude's, Sister Agnes and Sister Beatrice, their faces serene. Sister Clare, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. And Serafina, her eyes bright with purpose, standing beside them. He would stare at that photograph for long stretches, particularly on the anniversary of their disappearance, his mind replaying those last moments, searching for some overlooked detail, some premonition he might have missed. The passage of time did little to dull the edge of that particular day each October. The 28th anniversary approached with a familiar dread. Havenwood would hold its quiet memorial. Mrs. Henderson, whose children Sister Agnes had taught catechism, would bring flowers. Old Mr. Gable, who claimed Sister Beatrice's scones had saved his life more than once, would light a candle. Father Michael would lead the service, his voice carefully modulated to betray none of the turmoil raging within. This year, however, something felt different. A restlessness stirred in Father Michael, a deeper disquiet than usual. Perhaps it was the weight of nearly 3 decades, the stark realization that if Serafina were alive, she would be a woman of 45, her youth stolen. Or perhaps it was something less tangible, a subtle shift in the spiritual atmosphere, a faint whisper on the edge of his perception. He found himself drawn more insistently to the photograph of the nuns at St. Jude's, the number 7, notograph of the nuns. His gaze kept returning to the background, the simple lines of the chapel, the dark tree line behind it, St. Jude's. He hadn't been back there, not truly, since those frantic, hopeless days of the search. The mere thought of it usually brought a wave of nausea. The diocese had officially decommissioned the chapel years ago. It was deemed too remote, too costly to maintain, and too haunted by the tragedy. It was slowly surrendering to the forest, a forgotten relic. Yet now, an inexplicable urge pulled at him, a desire, almost a compulsion, to see it again, to walk where Serafina had walked her last known steps, to pray where she had prayed. It felt foolish, sentimental. What could possibly be gained after all these years? What answers could a decaying building and silent trees offer that 28 years of prayer and investigation had not? He tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to the heightened emotion of the anniversary, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. It was more than just a desire to connect with Serafina's memory. It felt directive, as if a thread, long dormant, was being tugged, urging him towards something. The night before the memorial service, sleep eluded him. He paced the confines of his small study, the photograph of St. Jude's clutched in his hand. The faces of the nuns seemed to look out at him, their expressions unreadable, yet somehow expectant. He remembered the words of his spiritual director in seminary. "Listen to the quiet nudges of the Spirit, Michael. They often come in the most unexpected ways." Was this such a nudge? Or was it simply the manifestation of a grief that had never found resolution, a desperate, irrational hope clinging to the last place his sister had been seen? By dawn, a decision had formed. After the memorial service, after he had fulfilled his obligations to his parishioners and to the memory of all 4 nuns, he would go. He would drive out to the old track, walk to St. Jude's, however dilapidated it might be. He didn't know what he expected to find. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just a moment of quiet communion with the past, a way to mark this grim anniversary in a more personal, if painful way. Or perhaps a tiny, almost heretical thought flickered in the recesses of his mind. There was still something there, a clue overlooked, a secret the woods had guarded for 28 long years. The rational part of him scoffed at the notion. The part of him that was a grieving brother, a priest who had questioned his God and found no answers, clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. He would go. Not for answers, he told himself, but for peace. Though deep down, he knew that peace would only come if the silence that had haunted him for nearly 3 decades was finally, irrevocably, broken. The scars of that silence ran too deep, had shaped too much of his life. He owed it to Serafina, to the other lost sisters, and to himself, to make one more pilgrimage into the Whispering Woods. The memorial service at St. Michael's Parish was as somber and heartfelt as always. The scent of lilies and beeswax hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint, lingering dampness of the coastal autumn. Father Michael Vance delivered his homily, his voice resonating with a practiced calm that belied the storm brewing within him. He spoke of faith, of remembrance, of the enduring mystery of God's plan. He looked out at the familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson dabbing her eyes. Old Mr. Gable staring fixedly at the altar, the younger parishioners who knew the story only as a sad chapter in Havenwood's history. He offered them comfort, even as his own heart ached with a fresh intensity. As the last parishioner filed out, offering their quiet condolences, Father Michael felt the weight of his decision press down on him. The urge to visit St. Jude's had not waned. If anything, it had intensified throughout the service, a persistent thrum beneath the surface of his liturgical duties. He changed out of his vestments, the simple black cassock feeling more like armor than priestly attire. In his small office, he paused before the photograph of the 4 nuns at St. Jude's. He carefully slipped it from its frame and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket, a silent promise. The drive from Havenwood towards the forested hills was a journey back in time. The neat houses and familiar streets gave way to scattered farms, then to the encroaching wilderness. The paved road narrowed, then turned to gravel, the towering redwoods pressing in on either side, their immense trunks dappled with moss, their canopy filtering the weak afternoon sun into an ethereal, green-tinged light. He hadn't driven this route in over 2 decades, yet every twist and turn was seared into his memory, each landmark a fresh prick of pain. This was the path he'd driven countless times during those frantic weeks of the search, his car filled with missing person flyers, his heart oscillating between desperate hope and crushing despair. He slowed as he approached the almost invisible turnoff for St. Jude's. It had once been a barely discernible dirt track, often muddy and rutted. He expected it to be even more overgrown now, perhaps impassable. Instead, he was met with a jarring sight. The old dirt track was gone. In its place was a neatly paved private road, wide enough for 2 cars. And blocking access was an imposing, ornate wrought iron gate at least 10 feet high, flanked by stone pillars. A large, professionally made sign declared in stark lettering, Crow Estate, private property, no trespassing. Smaller signs warned of guard dogs and surveillance. Father Michael pulled his modest sedan to the side of the road, a wave of bewildered disappointment washing over him. This couldn't be right. He got out, his legs feeling unsteady. He consulted the photograph in his pocket, comparing the distant ridgeline, the particular clustering of taller trees visible beyond the gate, to the image. There was no mistake. This was the location. But where was St. Jude's Chapel? The area beyond the gate was meticulously landscaped. Manicured lawns swept towards the tree line, interspersed with ornamental shrubs and flower beds that seemed incongruously vibrant against the wild backdrop of the redwood forest. There was no sign of the simple white chapel, no hint that a place of worship had ever stood there. It was as if St. Jude's had been erased, not just by time and neglect, but by deliberate human intervention. A chill snaked down Father Michael's spine. He fumbled for his aging cell phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Harold Jensen, the former groundskeeper for St. Michael's, who had occasionally helped with upkeep at St. Jude's in the old days. Harold was well into his 80s now, but his mind was still sharp. The phone rang several times before a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Jensen." "Harold, it's Father Michael Vance." A pause, then recognition. "Father Michael. Well, now that's a voice I haven't heard in a coon's age. How are you keeping?" "I'm well, Harold, thank you," Father Michael replied, though it felt like a lie. "Listen, I'm out by the old turnoff to St. Plenkensef. Jude's, and, well, the chapel seems to be gone. There's a large private estate here now." Another, longer pause. "Ah, that's right, Father. St. Jude's diocese decommissioned her. Oh, must be 26 years ago now. Sold the land. Some rich fella, Crow, Alistair Crow I think his name is, tore the old chapel down right away. Built himself a palace up in there. Demolished." The word hit Father Michael with the force of a physical blow. He had imagined it decaying, perhaps, reclaimed by the forest, but not actively destroyed, obliterated. I was never informed," he stammered, the omission feeling like another layer of betrayal. "My sister," Harold's voice softened with understanding. "It was a quiet affair, Father. After what happened to the sisters, attendance out there dropped to nothing. Then the bell tower started to go. Structural damage, they said. Nearly came down on Tom Beasley when he was up there checking on a leak. Bishop decided it wasn't worth the cost of repairs for a place nobody went to anymore, especially with the bad memories clinging to it. Sold it off quick. Crow paid a pretty penny, from what I hear." Father Michael stared at the imposing gate, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. "This Alistair Crow, does he still own the property?" "Far as I know. Keeps to himself mostly. Got a reputation for being a bit of a recluse. Not exactly welcoming to visitors, or so the talk goes." Disappointment, sharp and bitter, settled heavily on Father Michael. He had come all this way, driven by that strange, persistent urge, only to find a locked gate and the news that the place he sought no longer existed. "I see," he said slowly. "I had hoped, well, it's the anniversary today. I just wanted to visit, to pray." "Of course, Father. 28 years. A long time to carry such a burden," Harold said, his voice gentle. "I'm sorry you made the trip for nothing. Listen, I still live just a few miles from where you are. I managed to save a few things from St. Jude's before they tore it down, the old altar cross, some of the prayer kneelers, a couple of the stained glass panels. They're just gathering dust in my shed, but you're welcome to come by and see them if you'd like. Might bring a bit of comfort." The offer was kind, a small solace. "Thank you, Harold. That's very generous. Perhaps I will. But first, do you know if there's any other way to even see the site where the chapel stood? A public road that might pass nearby?" Harold hesitated. "Well, there's an old logging road that loops around the back of the Crow property. It's rough, mind you, probably not much used these days. But it might give you a vantage point. Can't promise much." After getting vague directions from Harold, Father Michael thanked him and ended the call. He stood by the gate for a long moment, the photograph of the 4 nuns feeling heavy in his pocket. The meticulously manicured grounds beyond the iron bars felt alien, a desecration of a place that, however humble, had once been sacred. The urge that had brought him here, however, hadn't entirely dissipated. It had merely shifted, morphing into a stubborn refusal to be turned away so easily. He got back into his car. Instead of heading towards Harold's, he turned onto the main road and, following Harold's uncertain directions, began searching for the old logging trail. He found it after a few wrong turns, a narrow, deeply rutted track almost swallowed by encroaching ferns and salal bushes. His sedan bumped and scraped along, the branches of overhanging trees scratching at the roof. After about 20 minutes of slow, arduous progress, the track began to climb, offering occasional glimpses through the dense trees. And then he saw it. Through a gap in the foliage he could make out a clearing. No, not a clearing, but an expanse of lawn, part of the Crow estate. And in the center of that lawn, where his memory insisted St. Jude's Chapel should have stood, was nothing but immaculately kept grass. A little further on, partially obscured by a stand of firs, rose the imposing structure of a massive, modern house, all stone and glass, looking more like a corporate retreat than a private home. It exuded wealth and an almost aggressive privacy. He pulled over, switched off the engine, and sat for a moment, a profound sense of desolation washing over him. It was truly gone. Erased. As he sat there, staring at the empty space where his sister had last been seen, a strange thing happened. The car radio, which he was certain he had turned off when he left Havenwood, crackled to life. Not with static or a distant station, but with a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was Gregorian chant, faint, ethereal, unmistakably the ancient, sacred music of monastic worship. His heart hammered against his ribs. He stared at the radio, his hand reaching out to touch the dial. It was off. The display was dark. Yet the sound persisted for several seconds, a pure, haunting melody, before fading away as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the sighing of the wind in the redwoods. "What in God's name?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Had he imagined it? A trick of an exhausted mind, overwrought with grief and disappointment? An electrical anomaly in his aging car? He turned the radio on, then off again. Silence. The mysterious chanting did not return, but the sensation that had drawn him here, that strange, insistent pull, surged back with an almost physical force. It was no longer just a vague urge. It was a conviction, sudden and absolute, that he was meant to be here now. That there was something he was missing, something vital. The air in the car felt charged, expectant. His skin tingled. He recognized the feeling. It was akin to moments of profound spiritual insight he'd experienced during deep prayer or meditation in his younger years. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and whispered, "Lord, guide me." When he opened them, his gaze fell upon the photograph in his lap, the one of the 4 nuns outside St. Jude's. His eyes scanned the background, the trees, the slope of the land. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, a faint sound seemed to emanate again, not from the radio this time, but seemingly from the air itself, or perhaps from deep within his own consciousness, the same ethereal chant, a beckoning. Without fully understanding his own actions, gripped by a certainty that transcended logic, Father Michael Vance put the car in gear, executed a careful turn on the narrow track, and began to drive back towards the main road, towards the ornate gates of the Crow estate. The desecrated place still held echoes, and he felt, with a chilling premonition, that he was about to discover why. The imposing wrought-iron gates of the Crow estate loomed before Father Michael Vance like the entrance to a fortress. The no trespassing signs, stark and unambiguous, seemed to glare at him. He parked his sedan on the narrow shoulder of the public road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The ethereal chanting, though now silent, still resonated in his ears, a ghostly summons that overrode years of ingrained propriety and respect for the law. "Lord, forgive me if I err in judgment," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the impenetrable barrier. "But lead me if this is your will." The strange certainty, the almost physical tug he'd experienced on the logging road persisted, a burning ember in his chest. After a moment of profound internal struggle, a battle between his priestly obligations and this inexplicable compulsion, he switched off the engine and stepped out of the car. He knew that attempting to breach the main gate would be futile and likely attract immediate attention. Instead, he began to walk along the perimeter fence, a formidable structure of heavy-gauge metal, at least 8 feet tall, that followed the contours of the land. It was designed not just to keep people out, but to project an aura of unassailable privacy. The forest pressed close on his right, the meticulously manicured grounds of the Crow estate visible through the bars on his left. His mind raced, trying to reconcile his actions with his conscience. Trespassing was a sin, a violation of another's property. Yet the memory of the ghostly chant, the profound sense that he was being guided, refused to be dismissed. And beneath it all, the raw, unhealed wound of Seraphina's disappearance throbbed with a fresh ache. If there was even the faintest, most improbable chance that some clue, some answer, lay beyond this fence after all these years. He scanned the grounds, trying to superimpose his memory of St. Jude's onto the alien landscape. The small chapel, he recalled, had stood on a slight rise. The ancient oak tree, where Sister Agnes often sat to read, was gone, presumably felled during Crow's extensive landscaping. but a distinctive cluster of mature ponderosa pines that had formed a backdrop to the chapel in the old photographs remained, a solitary, familiar landmark in a sea of change. He began to move along the fence line in that direction. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and slick with damp leaves. He walked carefully, his gaze alternating between the fence and the terrain underfoot. After about 50 yards, his foot caught on an exposed tree root hidden beneath a drift of pine needles. He stumbled heavily, his arms flailing for balance. His momentum carried him forward, and he instinctively threw his hands out, grasping the cold metal of the fence to break his fall. His full weight crashed against a section where the fence posts, set into a shallow, rocky patch of ground, seemed less secure than elsewhere. There was a sharp snapping sound, a groan of tortured metal. The section of fence, weakened by rust at a join or perhaps improperly installed, buckled outwards under his impact, creating a narrow, jagged gap near the ground, just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Father Michael found himself sprawled half on, half off the Crow property, the broken section of fence pressing into his side. "Oh, dear Lord," he muttered, scrambling to his feet, brushing dirt and pine needles from his black trousers. His heart hammered. He hadn't intended to damage the fence, let alone create an entry point. It was an accident, a clumsy misstep. Yet here he was, presented with an undeniable, if illicit, opportunity. Or was it a temptation? He glanced back towards the road, his breath catching in his throat. The lane was deserted. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the afternoon breeze and the distant caw of a raven. He looked down at the broken fence, then at the manicured clearing beyond, where St. Jude's had once stood sentinel. The ghostly chant seemed to echo faintly in his memory, a silent urging. "Forgive me, Father, for I am about to sin," he whispered, making the sign of the cross, his actions feeling almost surreal. Then, with a surge of adrenaline that overrode his trepidation, he carefully, awkwardly, squeezed his tall frame through the gap in the fence. Once inside the Crow estate, a palpable sense of transgression settled upon him. He moved swiftly but cautiously, sticking to the edge of the tree line where possible, heading towards the area where the ponderosa pines stood. The landscaping was immaculate, almost unnervingly perfect. Exotic shrubs and ornamental grasses, things that had no place in the native redwood ecosystem, were arranged in precise, geometric patterns. There was no trace, not even a foundation stone or a faded patch of earth, to indicate that a chapel had ever existed here. It was as if Aleister Crowe had deliberately, meticulously erased every vestige of its sacred past. The thought sent a fresh wave of sorrow and a nascent anger through him. He reached the approximate location where St. Jude's had stood, the cluster of pines his only reliable guide. He stood for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to reconcile the pristine, soulless lawn with his vivid memories of the humble wooden chapel, the worn pews, the scent of old incense and beeswax. It felt like standing on a grave that had been paved over and turned into a putting green. As he contemplated the profound emptiness of the site, a flicker of reflected light caught his eye. It came from near the ground, partially concealed by a low-growing, dense rhododendron bush a few yards away. Curious, his senses now hyper-alert, Father Michael moved towards it. He parted the thick, waxy leaves. There, set almost flush with the earth, was a metal grate. It was old, heavily weathered, its iron bars thick with rust. It looked like an air vent, perhaps 2 feet square, of a design that seemed to belong to a much older structure, possibly dating back to the 1920s or 30s, with faded, almost Art Deco scrollwork around its edges. It was utterly incongruous with the modern, minimalist landscaping and the opulent, contemporary design of Crowe's distant mansion. Father Michael frowned, perplexed. If St. Jude's Chapel had been built on a simple slab foundation, as Harold Jensen had implied, and as was common for such modest rural churches, why would there be an old air vent here? And if the chapel had been completely demolished, why would this remnant remain? Furthermore, why would a meticulously landscaped lawn, with no apparent subterranean structures, require ventilation? He crouched beside the vent, examining it more closely. The rust was deep, flaking away at his touch. The ground around it seemed slightly sunken, as if the earth had settled over something hollow beneath. He pressed his ear closer to the grate, though he wasn't sure what he expected to hear. The wind sighed through the pines, the leaves of the rhododendron rustled. And then he heard it. So faint at first, he thought he was imagining it, another trick of his overwrought senses, a soft, melodic humming. Not the clear ethereal chant from his car radio, but something more fragile, more human. It was intermittent, almost like someone humming absently to themselves. He held his breath, straining to listen. The humming came again, a little stronger this time, a wavering, melancholic tune that he couldn't quite place. It was followed by a distinct, dry cough. A human cough. Father Michael's blood ran cold. His heart leaped into his throat, pounding like a trapped bird. This was no electrical glitch, no figment of his imagination. This was real. Someone was down there. Someone was alive, beneath the earth, beneath the manicured lawn where St. Jude's Chapel had once stood. "Hello?" he called softly, his voice barely a whisper, pressing his face closer to the cold, rusty bars of the grate. "Is anyone there?" The humming stopped abruptly. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if he had been heard, if he had alerted someone to his presence, someone who shouldn't know he was there. He straightened up, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering, horrifying. An underground space? Here? And someone inside it? The image of his sister, Serafina, flashed before his eyes, unbidden, terrifying. 28 years. It was impossible. Utterly, monstrously impossible. Yet the cough, the humming, they had been undeniably real. He looked around wildly, half expecting to see Alistair Crowe bearing down on him, his face contorted with rage, perhaps flanked by the guard dogs mentioned on the warning signs. But the sprawling grounds remained eerily quiet, seemingly deserted. The main house was a distant, silent edifice, its windows like blank, unseeing eyes. No cameras were immediately visible in this secluded corner of the estate. His hand, trembling uncontrollably, fumbled in his pocket for his cell phone. His fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, struggled to dial the emergency number. The ghosts of St. Jude's were no longer just ethereal echoes. They had taken on a terrifying, tangible reality, and Father Michael Vance knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had stumbled upon a secret far darker and more horrifying than he could ever have imagined. The numbers on his phone screen swam before Father Michael's eyes. 9-1, -1. He took a deep, ragged breath, trying to steady his trembling hand, and pressed the call button. The silence on the other end felt like an eternity before a calm, professional voice answered, 911. "What is your emergency?" "My name is Father Michael Vance," he began, his voice low and urgent, his eyes darting around the secluded clearing, still terrified of being discovered. "I'm on the property of Alistair Crowe, near where the old St. Jude's Chapel used to stand, off Redwood Creek Road. I believe someone may be trapped, or held, underground." He paused, acutely aware of how insane his words must sound. "I heard someone, humming and coughing, coming from an old air vent in the ground." There was a brief, pregnant silence on the line. Then the dispatcher's voice, carefully neutral. "Sir, are you saying you suspect someone is being held against their will?" "I don't know," Father Michael admitted, frustration and fear warring within him. "But there's definitely someone down there. There's an underground space of some kind. Given the remote location, the fact this is heavily secured private property, I'm deeply concerned." "Are you on the property legally, sir?" the dispatcher asked, a note of skepticism creeping into her tone. Father Michael winced. I accidentally damaged a section of the perimeter fence, and I found myself on the grounds. I realize I'm trespassing, but this seemed like an emergency. I couldn't ignore it." "I understand, sir. Can you describe your exact location on the property?" He did his best, explaining his position relative to the cluster of ponderosa pines and the distant main house, emphasizing the incongruous nature of the old air vent in the meticulously landscaped area. "We'll dispatch officers to investigate, sir," the dispatcher assured him. "Please remain where you are until they arrive, unless you feel you are in immediate danger. If so, try to make your way back to the public road." "Thank you," Father Michael breathed, a wave of relief washing over him, quickly followed by a fresh surge of anxiety for the person or people below. "I'll wait by my vehicle, near the main gate on Redwood Creek Road." After ending the call, he took one last, lingering look at the rusty air vent. The humming had not resumed. The silence from below was now as unnerving as the sounds had been. He made his way back to the broken section of fence, his heart still pounding, and carefully squeezed through the gap, feeling a profound sense of relief to be back on the public side of the barrier, even though his transgression now felt justified. As he walked briskly towards his parked car, his mind raced. He needed more information, anything that could corroborate his incredible discovery. He dialed Harold Jensen's number again. "Harold, it's Father Michael. I need to ask you something critically important. When St. Jude's was still standing, was there any kind of basement, cellar, or underground room beneath it? Anything at all?" Harold sounded surprised by the urgency in his voice. "No, Father, not that I ever knew of. Chapel was built on a simple concrete slab. No crypt, no storage cellar, nothing like that. Solid ground beneath, far as I was ever aware." "Why do you ask, Father? You sound agitated." Father Michael quickly explained what he had found, the old air vent, the sounds of someone humming and coughing from below ground. That's impossible, Father," Harold said, his voice now laced with disbelief and a dawning unease. "There was never any underground structure at St. Jude's. I maintained that chapel and its grounds, off and on, for nearly 30 years before the diocese sold it. I'd have known if there was something like that. Then the only explanation," Father Michael concluded, his voice grim, "is that someone built it after the chapel was demolished, after Alistair Crowe took ownership." "Sweet Mother Mary," Harold whispered. That's deeply disturbing, Father. What are you going to do?" "I've already called the sheriff's department. They're sending officers to investigate." "I'll come too," Harold decided immediately. "I know that land, Father, better than anyone still breathing likely. I can be there in 15 minutes. Father Michael thanked him and ended the call, then sagged against his car, his legs feeling weak. He fumbled for his rosary, its smooth, worn beads a familiar comfort in his trembling fingers, and began to pray, not the formal prayers of the liturgy, but desperate, incoherent pleas for the safety of whoever was trapped beneath Alistair Crowe's manicured lawn, and for the truth, however horrifying, to finally be brought into the light. He hadn't been waiting long when a battered pickup truck, unmistakably Harold Jensen's, rumbled to a stop behind his sedan. The elderly man emerged, his weathered face etched with concern and a grim curiosity. "Father Michael," Harold called, his voice raspy. "Any sign of the law yet?" "Not yet, Harold," Father Michael replied, stepping out to greet him. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Harold nodded, his keen eyes scanning the imposing gates of the Crowe estate, then the surrounding forest. "Been thinking about what you told me on the drive over. It makes no earthly sense. If Crowe built something underground where the chapel stood, folk would have noticed the construction. You can't dig out a basement, let alone anything more substantial, without heavy equipment, trucks, a whole crew, unless it was done covertly," Father Michael suggested, his mind grasping at possibilities. "Gradually, over time. Or perhaps there was some pre-existing natural cavity, a small cave system, that he expanded upon?" Harold shook his head doubtfully. "This area ain't known for caves, Father. Mostly solid bedrock, clay, and sandstone beneath a few feet of topsoil. Nothing that would lend itself to easy tunneling. Not without serious effort and a lot of noise." Before they could speculate further, the distant wail of approaching sirens sliced through the quiet afternoon air. A Shasta County Sheriff's Department cruiser, lights flashing, rounded the bend in Redwood Creek Road and pulled up in front of Father Michael's car. The siren died with a mournful sigh. 2 deputies emerged. One was older, Deputy Williams, his hair graying at the temples, his demeanor professional but not unkind. The other, Deputy Reynolds, was younger, leaner, with an alert, watchful quality in his movements. "Father Michael Vance?" Deputy Williams asked, his gaze assessing. "Yes, officer. Thank you for coming." Father Michael gestured towards his companion. "This is Harold Jensen. He was the caretaker of St. Jude's Chapel that once stood on this property for many years." Deputy Williams nodded in acknowledgement. "I'm Deputy Williams. This is Deputy Reynolds. Dispatch relayed your report. Sounds of a person or persons coming from a subterranean location on Mr. Crowe's private property. Can you walk us through exactly what you observed, Father?" Father Michael recounted the events of the afternoon. His visit to the site, his accidental breaching of the fence, the discovery of the air vent, and the distinct sounds of humming and coughing he'd heard emanating from below. He was careful to emphasize his contrition for the trespassing, which Deputy Williams acknowledged with a non-committal wave of his hand. "Let's focus on the potential welfare issue first," the deputy said, his tone all business. "If someone is indeed trapped or being held against their will, that takes precedence over a minor property infringement. Mr. Jensen, you said you were familiar with the old chapel?" Harold interjected, his voice firm. "Knew it like the back of my hand, deputy. And I can tell you for a fact, there was never any basement, any cellar, any kind of underground room associated with St. Jude's Chapel. Whatever's down there now, if anything, was built after Alistair Crowe bought the land and tore the chapel down." Deputy Reynolds, who had been quietly taking notes in a small pad, looked up. "Mr. Alistair Crowe is a prominent and very wealthy landowner in these parts. These are serious allegations, Father, Mr. Jensen." "I understand that, Deputy," Father Michael said solemnly. "I am not accusing Mr. Crowe of anything specific at this point. I am simply reporting what I heard and expressing my grave concern for whoever or whatever might be the source of those sounds." Deputy Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. Let's take a look at this air vent you discovered. Father, if you'd lead the way to where you gained access, Mr. Jensen, given your familiarity with the old layout, perhaps you'd accompany us as well." "Be glad to," Harold agreed. The four men walked towards the damaged section of fence. Father Michael pointed out the gap, and they carefully made their way through onto Alistair Crowe's property, the deputy's expressions unreadable, but their movements now imbued with a heightened alertness. The air felt thick with unspoken tension. Father Michael led them through the ornamental shrubbery to the partially concealed air vent. "Here it is," he said, his voice hushed, parting the branches to reveal the rusted grate. Deputy Williams crouched beside it, his gloved hand brushing away some of the accumulated leaves and debris. He examined the vent with a practiced, critical eye. "This is old ironwork, certainly," he mused. "Doesn't match the modern landscaping or the likely age of Crowe's main residence at all. Looks like it could be from the early to mid-20th century." Deputy Reynolds joined him, shining a powerful flashlight down through the grate. "Can't see much. Shaft angles off sharply after about 6 or 7 feet. No clear view to any chamber below from this angle." "Listen," Father Michael urged, his own heart beginning to pound again. "Just be quiet for a moment, please." The four men fell silent. The only sounds, the sighing of the wind in the ponderosa pines and the distant chirping of birds. For nearly a minute, there was nothing. Father Michael began to despair, a cold dread seeping into him. Had he imagined it all? Had the stress and grief of the anniversary finally pushed him over some invisible edge? Then, faintly, but with undeniable clarity, it came again. A woman's voice, humming a soft, sorrowful melody. It was the same tune he'd heard earlier, fragile, wavering, yet achingly human. The melody continued for several seconds, then faded, replaced by a series of dry, rasping coughs that seemed to echo from a confined space. The two deputies exchanged a significant, silent glance. Deputy Reynolds straightened up, his expression now undeniably grave. "That's definitely someone down there," he stated, his voice low and firm. "And from the sound of that cough, they may well be in distress or require medical attention." Deputy Williams rose, his gaze sweeping the meticulously kept grounds towards the distant, imposing mansion of Alistair Crowe. "We need to speak with Mr. Crowe, immediately. This has now escalated from a strange report to a priority welfare check, potentially a serious crime scene." His hand instinctively rested on the butt of his holstered service weapon. The unveiling of the sound was one thing. The nature of the unseen below was now a matter of urgent, official concern. The walk from the secluded air vent back towards the main gate of the Crowe estate felt significantly more charged than their entry. The rustling leaves underfoot, the sigh of the wind through the towering redwoods, even the distant caw of a crow, now seemed imbued with a sinister undertone. The knowledge that someone was alive, concealed beneath the manicured perfection of Alistair Crowe's property, hung heavy in the air. "Father Vance, Mr. Jensen, we'd appreciate it if you'd wait by your vehicles on the public road while we make initial contact with Mr. Crowe," Deputy Williams instructed as they approached the damaged section of fence. His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for argument. "This is now an official police matter, and for your own safety, it's best you remain at a distance." Father Michael nodded, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He and Harold squeezed back through the gap, leaving the deputies to secure it as best they could before proceeding towards the main entrance of the estate. They watched as the two officers walked with purposeful strides up the long paved driveway towards the imposing stone and glass edifice that was Aleister Crow's residence. The house, Father Michael thought, looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum, grand, cold, and secretive. From their vantage point near the gate, they saw the deputies reach the massive front door and knock. Several long moments passed. The silence stretched, amplifying the tension. Finally, the door swung inward, but it wasn't Aleister Crow who appeared. Instead, a uniformed man, likely private security, stepped out. Words were exchanged, gestures made. The security guard spoke into a device on his shoulder, then, after another pause, stepped back to allow the deputies entry. The heavy door closed behind them, swallowing them into the belly of the beast. "He's got his own private army, it seems," Harold muttered, squinting towards the distant house. "Never did trust a man who needed that many walls and guards around him. What's he got to hide?" Father Michael didn't answer. He was too consumed by a maelstrom of emotions: fear for the person trapped below, a dawning horror at the potential depravity he had stumbled upon, and a desperate, fervent prayer that the deputies would uncover the truth. The minutes crawled by, each one an agony of suspense. Nearly 20 minutes later, the front door of the mansion opened again. The two deputies emerged, followed by a tall, imposing figure. Even from this distance, Father Michael could discern an aura of wealth and arrogance about him. This had to be Aleister Crow. He was dressed not in casual attire, but in a tailored dark suit, as if expecting important business, though it was late afternoon on a weekday. His silver hair was impeccably styled, his posture ramrod straight. He gestured dismissively as he spoke to the deputies, his body language radiating impatience and disdain. The conversation on the doorstep was brief. Then, to Father Michael's surprise, Aleister Crow, flanked by the two deputies, began to walk down the long driveway towards the main gate, towards them. As they drew closer, Father Michael could see Crow's face more clearly. It was a handsome face, in a severe, predatory way, with cold, pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing and betray nothing. He was perhaps in his late 60s or early 70s, but carried himself with the vigor of a much younger man. When his gaze fell upon Father Michael and Harold Jensen standing by their vehicles, his expression, already stern, hardened into one of outright hostility. "Deputy Williams, Deputy Reynolds," Crow said as they reached the gate, his voice a low, cultured baritone that nevertheless carried an edge of steel. "I believe I have made my position abundantly clear. There is no one on my property who is not authorized to be here. Your anonymous tip is patently absurd, a malicious fabrication." His eyes flicked contemptuously towards Father Michael. "Likely orchestrated by this trespassing priest, who seems to have a personal vendetta against me for lawfully purchasing and improving this land." "Mr. Crow," Deputy Williams began, his tone measured but firm, "we have reason to believe, based on direct sensory evidence gathered by ourselves and Father Vance, that there may be an individual in a subterranean enclosure on your property, specifically in the vicinity of the former St. Jude's Chapel site. We heard distinct human sounds, humming and coughing, emanating from an old air vent in that location." A muscle twitched in Crow's jaw, the only outward sign of any disturbance to his composed demeanor. "An air vent? You're referring, I presume, to a decorative grate covering a component of the extensive drainage system I had installed when I landscaped that area years ago. It's designed to prevent waterlogging of the lawns. What you heard was likely the wind, or perhaps small animals. Your imaginations, fueled by this priest's fantasies, are running wild." "Sir, with all due respect," Deputy Reynolds interjected, his voice polite but insistent. "The sounds were unmistakably human. We all heard them, a woman's voice humming, and a distinct cough. This isn't about imagination, it's about a credible welfare concern." "A woman's voice?" Crow scoffed, a humorless smile touching his lips. "Gentlemen, I live alone, attended only by my household staff, all of whom are accounted for and none of whom are currently humming in my drainage system. This is preposterous. I demand you identify your anonymous source, who seems so keen on harassing me." "Our source, at this point, is our own observation, Mr. Crow, corroborated by Father Vance," Deputy Williams stated. "Given the nature of what we've heard, and the potential for someone to be in distress or unlawfully confined, we are requesting your voluntary consent to conduct a thorough search of your property, specifically the area around the former chapel site and any potential underground access points. Crow's eyes narrowed to icy slits. Absolutely not. This is private property. I will not have you traipsing through my grounds on some ludicrous witch hunt instigated by a meddling cleric. You have no right to search without a warrant. And I assure you, if you attempt to procure one based on such flimsy, fabricated evidence, my attorneys will have a field day. His gaze, filled with venom, fixed on Father Michael. This is harassment, pure and simple. This man, he gestured towards the priest, is clearly unhinged, obsessed with a tragedy that happened decades ago. He's broken onto my land, damaged my property, and is now attempting to further his campaign of vexation by involving law enforcement. I heard what I heard, Mr. Crow, Father Michael said, his voice trembling slightly but firm. As God is my witness, there is someone down there, someone who needs help. Ah, invoking God now, are we, Father? Crow sneered. How very convenient. Tell me, does your divine witness also condone trespassing and bearing false witness against your neighbor? That's enough, Mr. Crow. Deputy Williams cut in sharply, his patience clearly wearing thin. We are not accusing you of anything at this juncture. We are attempting to ascertain the welfare of a potential individual in distress. Your refusal to cooperate, while within your rights without a warrant, is noted. Noted? Crow laughed, a short, barking sound devoid of mirth. Note this, Deputy. I want these individuals, he waved a dismissive hand at Father Michael and Harold, off the public road bordering my property immediately. And I want you and your partner to leave my estate. If you wish to pursue this fantasy further, do so through the proper legal channels. In the meantime, you are all disturbing my peace. Recognizing the impasse, Deputy Williams exchanged a look with Deputy Reynolds. He then turned to Father Michael and Harold. Father, Mr. Jensen, it appears Mr. Crow is unwilling to grant consent for a search at this time. We will have to explore other avenues. For now, it would be best if you return to Havenwood. We have your contact information, and will be in touch. Crow watched, his arms crossed, a smug, triumphant expression settling on his features as Father Michael and Harold reluctantly moved towards their vehicles. The deputies lingered for a moment, speaking in low tones to Crow, before they too turned and walked back towards their cruiser. As Father Michael slid behind the wheel of his car, his heart sank. Crow's denial had been absolute, his arrogance infuriating. Yet, there had been something in his eyes, a fleeting flicker of something. Not fear, perhaps, but a tightly controlled awareness, a chilling self-possession that was more disturbing than any outburst would have been. Before driving away, Deputy Williams approached Father Michael's car window. "Don't worry, Father," he said, his voice low. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. His refusal under these circumstances is highly suspicious. I'm heading back to the station to speak with my sergeant and the district attorney's office immediately. We're going to pursue an emergency search warrant based on what we all heard. That man is hiding something. I'm sure of it." A small ember of hope rekindled in Father Michael's chest. "Thank you, Deputy. I know how unbelievable this all sounds, but I truly believe someone's life may be at stake." "I believe you, Father," Williams replied, his gaze steady. "We all heard it. Whether it's what you fear or something else entirely, we have a duty to find out. Go home. Get some rest. We'll be in touch as soon as we have an update." With a final nod, Deputy Williams returned to his cruiser. Father Michael watched as the police car pulled away, followed by Harold Jensen's pickup truck. He waited a moment longer, his gaze drawn back to the imposing gates of the Crow estate. Behind them, Alistair Crow had already retreated into his fortress, leaving only the silence of the whispering woods and the horrifying secret it concealed. The denials of the recluse had only strengthened Father Michael's conviction. The truth lay buried, and it was fighting to be unearthed. The drive back to Havenwood was a blur for Father Michael. The conversation with Deputy Williams replayed in his mind, a fragile lifeline of hope. Crow's cold, arrogant denials, his veiled threats, the chilling self-assurance in his eyes, it all pointed to a man with something terrible to conceal. Harold Jensen, who had followed him back to St. Michael's rectory, was uncharacteristically quiet, his weathered face grim. "That Crow fella? He's got the devil in him, Father," Harold finally said, as they sat in the priest's small, cluttered study, the scent of old books and lingering incense, a stark contrast to the raw, elemental fear they'd encountered. "I've seen that look before, in men who've done dark deeds and think they're smart enough to get away with it." The deputies seemed convinced, Father Michael said, more to reassure himself than Harold. Deputy Williams said he'd pursue an emergency warrant immediately. "Let's pray they get it, and soon," Harold replied, shaking his head. "Every minute that passes, if there truly is someone down there, in that hole—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken horror hung heavy between them. The hours that followed were an agonizing torment of waiting. Father Michael tried to immerse himself in parish duties, to respond to emails, to review the upcoming Sunday lectionary, but his mind refused to focus. Every creak of the old rectory floorboards, every distant siren, sent a jolt of anxiety through him. He found himself pacing, his rosary beads clicking through his fingers, his prayers a desperate, repetitive plea for intervention, for justice, for the safety of the unknown soul trapped beneath Crow's land. He called his bishop to apprise him of the situation, carefully choosing his words to convey the gravity without sounding unhinged. Bishop Davies, a pragmatic man, listened patiently, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to concern as Father Michael recounted the deputy's corroboration of the sounds. He offered prayers and promised the diocese's support, should it be needed. Late in the afternoon, Father Michael's phone finally rang. It was Deputy Williams. "Father Vance," the deputy's voice was businesslike, but carried an undercurrent of controlled excitement. "We have it. Judge Morrison reviewed our affidavit. Listened to the recordings from our body cams. The audio of the humming and coughing was faint but discernible. She's granted an emergency search warrant for the Crow estate. Full access to the grounds, the main residence, and any outbuildings or subterranean structures. We're assembling a team now. We'll be executing the warrant within the next 2 hours, aiming for just before dusk." Relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over Father Michael. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank you, Deputy. Will you let me know what you find?" "You'll be one of the first civilians we notify, Father," Williams assured him. "This entire investigation was initiated because of your courage and persistence. We owe you that." However, his tone became more cautionary. "I must strongly advise you to stay away from the Crow estate while the warrant is being executed. This is now an official and potentially hazardous police operation. Mr. Crow is wealthy, well-connected, and clearly volatile. We don't know how he'll react when we serve him with this. For your safety, please remain in Havenwood." Father Michael understood, though the desire to be there, to witness whatever was to be uncovered, was a powerful pull. "I understand, Deputy, but if you do find someone, particularly if it's—" He couldn't bring himself to say Serafina's name. "We'll handle it with the utmost sensitivity, Father," Williams promised. "And you will be informed immediately if there are any significant developments regarding any potential long-term missing persons." After the call, Harold, who had been listening intently, looked at Father Michael. "He's right, Father. It's best we stay clear. But I can't just sit here and do nothing. My heart's about to beat out of my chest." "Mine too, Harold," Father Michael admitted. "But we must trust the authorities now. They have the means and the legal right to do what we cannot." An idea then sparked in Harold's eyes. "The old logging road," he said slowly. "The one you took this afternoon. It overlooks a portion of the Crow property, doesn't it? From a safe distance, mind you. We wouldn't be interfering. Just watching, bearing witness." Father Michael hesitated. It was perilously close to disobeying Deputy Williams' explicit instructions. Yet, the thought of being completely removed, of waiting passively for news while a drama of unknown proportions unfolded so close by, was almost unbearable. "A safe distance, Harold?" "Absolutely, Father. High up on the ridge. We wouldn't even be visible from the estate grounds. Just 2 old men saying their prayers, watching the sunset." There was a stubborn glint in Harold's eye. Against his better judgment, but swayed by his own desperate need to be near, Father Michael found himself agreeing. "All right, Harold, but strictly as observers. At the first sign of any trouble, or if we're asked to leave, we do so immediately." As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, Father Michael and Harold once again found themselves in Harold's battered pickup truck, bumping and grinding their way up the overgrown logging road. They parked at a vantage point Harold knew well, a small, rocky outcrop partially concealed by a stand of manzanita overlooking the sprawling Crow estate below. From here, they could see the main house, a portion of the manicured lawns where St. Jude's had once stood, and the winding private driveway. The distance was considerable, ensuring their invisibility, but close enough to discern movement. They didn't have to wait long. A convoy of official vehicles began to arrive at the main gates of the Crow estate, several sheriff's department cruisers, a larger forensic van, and, ominously, an ambulance staging discreetly, a short distance down Redwood Creek Road. The sight of the ambulance sent a fresh chill down Father Michael's spine. "They're taking this very seriously," Harold murmured, his voice hushed. Through a pair of old binoculars Harold kept in his truck, they watched as a contingent of deputies, led by Williams and Reynolds, approached the massive front door of Crow's mansion, warrant in hand. The door opened, and this time Alistair Crow himself appeared, his silver hair glinting in the fading light. Even from this distance, his posture radiated fury. An animated, clearly heated exchange took place. Crow gestured angrily, but the deputies stood firm, one of them holding out the official document. Finally, with an air of barely suppressed rage, Crow stepped aside, and the officers entered the house. "They're in," Father Michael breathed, his knuckles white as he gripped the binoculars. The wait that followed was excruciating. The lights in Crow's mansion blazed, figures moving behind the large picture windows. The grounds, however, remained dark and still. An hour passed, then another. The moon, a pale sliver, rose above the black silhouette of the redwoods. "What are they doing in there for so long?" Harold fretted, stamping his feet against the evening chill. "A house that size, Harold. It will take time to search it thoroughly," Father Michael replied, though his own patience was stretched to its limit. He imagined the deputies meticulously going from room to room, opening closets, checking cellars, all while Alistair Crow, a caged tiger, watched with impotent fury. Suddenly, a new flurry of activity began near the main house. Several deputies emerged, accompanied by Alistair Crow, who was now being firmly, though not roughly, escorted. They didn't head towards the front gate, but towards a narrower, less distinct path that seemed to lead deeper into the forested part of Crow's property, in the general direction of the old chapel site. "They're moving him," Father Michael said, his voice tight with anticipation. "They're taking him towards the area of the vent." The group of figures, illuminated by powerful flashlights, disappeared among the trees. For several long minutes, there was nothing but the distant pinpricks of their lights moving through the darkness. Then, the lights converged on a spot that Father Michael and Harold recognized as the approximate location of the old storage shed Harold had mentioned, a structure that sat further along the private track connecting the main house to the former chapel grounds. The lights remained stationary around the shed for what felt like an eternity. Father Michael's hands trembled so violently he could barely hold the binoculars steady. He imagined the deputies questioning Crow, perhaps searching the shed itself. What secrets did that dilapidated structure hold? Was it merely a forgotten outbuilding, or was it something more? Then, a new light appeared, a bright, focused beam directed downwards, as if into the earth itself. "They found something," Harold whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Father, I think they've found the entrance." From their distant perch on the ridge, two old men, watchers in the encroaching night, could only wait, their hearts pounding in unison with the unseen drama unfolding below, praying that the darkness that had held Havenwood captive for 28 years was finally about to yield its horrifying secrets to the light. The beam of light from below, a stark white gash in the darkness around the old storage shed, was a beacon of both hope and dread for Father Michael and Harold. From their vantage point on the ridge, they could only imagine the scene unfolding. The deputies, their faces grim and determined. Alistair Crow, his arrogance perhaps finally cracking under the weight of irrefutable discovery. Time stretched, each second a drawn-out agony. They saw more figures moving towards the shed, likely the forensic team, their presence a somber confirmation that this was no mere welfare check. The ambulance, which had been staging on Redwood Creek Road, began to move slowly up the private driveway, its emergency lights now activated, casting eerie, rotating flashes against the dark backdrop of the redwoods. "They've found someone, Father," Harold breathed, his voice choked with emotion. "They must have." Father Michael could only nod, his throat too tight for words. His gaze was locked on the distant scene, his prayers a silent, frantic storm. He clutched the worn wooden crucifix of his rosary, its familiar contours, a small anchor in the overwhelming sea of his emotions. It was nearly an hour later, the moon now higher in the inky sky, when they saw the first tangible sign of what had been uncovered. A team of paramedics emerged from the direction of the shed, carefully maneuvering a stretcher. Even from this distance, the figure on the stretcher appeared small, incredibly frail, almost lost beneath the blankets. Father Michael's breath hitched. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force he thought it might break free. Was it her? After all these years, could it truly be Serafina? Or was it another victim, another lost soul swallowed by Alistair Crow's depravity? The stretcher was carefully loaded into the waiting ambulance. Almost immediately, another group emerged, this time carrying a body bag. The stark, clinical finality of it sent a fresh wave of grief and horror through Father Michael. One rescued, perhaps. One lost, certainly. Who? The questions tore at him. Then, a sight that made his blood run cold and hot in equal measure. Alistair Crow, no longer merely escorted, but clearly in custody, his hands cuffed behind his back. Two deputies flanked him, their expressions grim. Crow's silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit rumpled. The arrogant mask had shattered, replaced by a look of dawning shock and a terrifying, animalistic fury. He was being led not towards the main house, but towards one of the sheriff's cruisers parked near the gate. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, a primal need overriding all caution, Father Michael found himself scrambling down the rocky outcrop, ignoring Harold's startled cry. "Father, wait! It's not safe." But Father Michael couldn't wait. He half ran, half stumbled down the overgrown logging track, his cassock catching on branches, his lungs burning. He had to know. He had to see. He reached the public road just as the ambulance, its siren now wailing a mournful lament, was pulling away from the Crow Estate gates, heading towards Havenwood and the distant hospital. He watched it go, a maelstrom of hope and dread swirling within him. A scene of controlled chaos greeted him at the perimeter of the estate. Yellow police tape now cordoned off the entrance. Officers were directing traffic, keeping a small crowd of curious onlookers, drawn by the lights and sirens at bay. Father Michael pushed his way forward, his clerical collar his only passport. "Please," he gasped, addressing a stern-faced deputy. "I'm Father Vance. The individuals they found, my sister, Serafina Vance, was one of the nuns who disappeared from St. Jude's 28 years ago. I need to know." The deputy's expression softened slightly with recognition. He'd clearly been briefed. "Father Vance, please wait here a moment." He spoke into his radio, his voice low. After a brief exchange, he turned back. "They're bringing Mr. Crow out now, Father. It might be best if you step back." But it was too late. Alistair Crow, his face a mask of contorted rage, was being led past. His cold, pale eyes, now burning with a terrifying, unholy light, locked onto Father Michael. For a moment, he seemed to struggle against the grip of the deputies. Then, with a guttural snarl, Crow lunged, spitting directly at the priest. The spittle landed on Father Michael's cheek, a vile, demeaning assault. "Proud of yourself, Father?" Crow hissed, his voice venomous, before the deputies yanked him back forcefully and bundled him into the back of a cruiser. Father Michael, stunned, slowly wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. He felt not anger nor revulsion, but a profound, sorrowful pity for the twisted soul of the man being driven away. "I count it for joy," he whispered, the words of St. Paul coming unbidden to his lips, "that I have been considered worthy to suffer disgrace for the name." Just then, Deputy Williams approached him, his face etched with exhaustion and a grim satisfaction. "Father Vance," he said, his voice heavy, "we found them, or rather, what remains of most of them." Father Michael's heart seized. "Most of them?" Williams nodded, his gaze unwavering. "In a series of crudely constructed underground chambers, accessed via a hidden staircase beneath the floor of that old storage shed. The conditions were appalling." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We found human remains in 2 of the chambers, skeletal. Based on the location, and some items found with them, we believe them to be 2 of the missing nuns. The coroner will have to confirm, of course. Given the state of decomposition, they've likely been deceased for many, many years." A wave of dizziness washed over Father Michael. 2 gone. Mildred, Beatrice, Claire? The names, the faces, swam before his eyes. And the others? He managed to choke out. A flicker of something unreadable crossed William's face. "In the furthest chamber, Father, we found a survivor." Father Michael's breath caught. His legs felt like they might buckle. "A survivor?" "Yes, Father," William said, his voice softening. "An elderly woman, emaciated, in extremely poor health, but alive. She was conscious. She identified herself." He took a deep breath. She said her name was Sister Seraphina Vance. The world tilted. The sounds of the busy crime scene, the crackle of radios, the murmur of voices, the distant slam of a car door, faded into a roaring in Father Michael's ears. Seraphina, alive. After 28 years of darkness, 28 years of believing her lost forever, his sister was alive. Tears, hot and unrestrained, streamed down his face. He swayed, and Deputy Williams put a steadying hand on his arm. "She's on her way to Havenwood General, Father. The paramedics are doing everything they can. She's incredibly weak, but she's a fighter. She asked for you." "She asked for me?" The words were a choked whisper. "She did, Father. One of the first things she said, her brother, she knew you wouldn't give up." Harold Jensen had finally made his way down from the ridge and now stood beside Father Michael, his own eyes glistening, his hand gripping the priest's shoulder in a gesture of profound solidarity. "We also found journals in Crow's main residence, Father," Deputy Williams continued, his voice hardening again. "Detailed, disturbing journals. It appears he meticulously documented his obsession with the nuns, his hatred for the church. He documented their captivity. The two older nuns, Mildred Hayes and Joan Keller, according to his entries, died within the first few years. Sister Beatrice Moreau survived much longer, nearly a decade before succumbing to illness." He paused. "The remains we found, they align with his timeline for Sister Beatrice and one of the older sisters. We're still searching for the location of the fourth. So, Agnes and Joan had perished early. Beatrice later. And Seraphina. Seraphina had endured. The sheer, unimaginable horror of it, the miracle of her survival, battled for dominance in Father Michael's shattered mind. Crow's journals indicate he abducted them during their retreat at St. Jude's," Williams went on, piecing together the horrifying narrative. "Drugged them, transported them to the pre-existing, though likely expanded, chambers he'd prepared after purchasing the land and demolishing the chapel. He kept them isolated, their existence a secret he nurtured for nearly 3 decades. His motivations appear to stem from a deeply twisted personal history involving his mother, who was a nun, and an abusive, religiously fanatical upbringing. The pieces of the puzzle, so long scattered and incomprehensible, were falling into place, revealing a picture of monstrous, calculated evil." "The ambulance," Father Michael said suddenly, his voice regaining a desperate strength. "I need to get to the hospital. I need to see her." "Of course, Father," Deputy Williams said. "Harold, can you drive him?" Harold nodded, his face a mixture of shock, grief, and awe. "It's a miracle, Father Michael, a true, honest-to-God miracle." As Harold helped him towards the pickup truck, Father Michael looked back at the Crow estate, now swarming with forensic investigators, their lights cutting through the darkness. The Chamber of Lost Souls had finally yielded its secrets. One soul, impossibly, had returned from the abyss. And Father Michael Vance, after a lifetime of searching, was about to be reunited with the sister he had never truly given up on, a testament to a faith that, even in its darkest hours, had refused to be extinguished. The harsh, sterile lights of Havenwood General Hospital's emergency entrance cast long, dancing shadows as the paramedics wheeled the gurney through the automatic doors. Father Michael and Harold arrived moments behind the ambulance, their hearts pounding in unison with the urgency of the scene. A nurse, her face a mask of professional calm but her eyes betraying a compassionate understanding, intercepted them. "Father Vance, I'm Nurse Collins. Your sister, Sister Seraphina, is being stabilized. She's in extremely critical condition, but she's conscious. The doctors are with her now. You can't go in just yet. They need space to work. Please, have a seat in the waiting area. Someone will be out to speak with you as soon as possible." Reluctantly, Father Michael allowed Harold to guide him to the small, impersonal waiting room. The air smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. He sank into a worn plastic chair, the adrenaline that had fueled him for hours finally ebbing, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and an overwhelming flood of emotions. Serafina was alive. The words repeated in his mind, a sacred, unbelievable litany. "She had her faith, Father," Harold said softly, breaking the silence. "That's what kept her going. It had to be." Father Michael nodded, tears blurring his vision. He remembered the stories of saints and martyrs, of endurance beyond human comprehension. His sister, she was one of them. He recalled Deputy Williams mentioning the journals, the meticulous documentation of Crow's cruelty. What horrors had she endured? How had she survived when others, stronger perhaps in body, had not? A doctor, a woman in her late 40s with kind, tired eyes, emerged and approached them. "Father Vance? I'm Dr. Emily Carter, the attending physician." Father Michael shot to his feet. "My sister? How is she?" Dr. Carter gestured for them to sit. "Sister Serafina is remarkably resilient. But I must be frank, Father. Her physical condition is dire. She's suffering from severe malnutrition, advanced muscle atrophy, profound vitamin D deficiency from decades without sunlight, and multiple healed fractures that were clearly never set properly. Her immune system is critically compromised. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her, to reintroduce nutrients slowly, to manage the shock to her system." Can I see her?" Father Michael asked, his voice hoarse. "Soon," Dr. Carter promised. "We're moving her to a private room in the ICU. We need to maintain a sterile environment. Anyone who enters will need to wear full protective gear, gown, mask, gloves. And visits will have to be very brief initially. Her system can't handle much stimulation." She paused, then a gentle smile touched her lips. "She asked for you, Father, repeatedly." She kept saying, "My brother Michael, he will come." The doctor's words were a fresh wave of solace, washing over the raw pain. Serafina had known. She had held on to that hope, that faith in him, through all those unimaginable years. The wait stretched, punctuated by the hushed comings and goings of hospital staff. Deputy Williams called with an update. Alistair Crow was in custody, refusing to speak without his attorney. The search of the underground chambers was ongoing. They had found more evidence of the nuns' long captivity: crude carvings on the walls, makeshift rosaries crafted from threads and tiny pebbles, a heartbreaking testament to their enduring faith in the face of utter despair. They had also located the remains of the fourth nun, likely Sister Agnes Peltier, buried in a shallow grave in a remote section of Crow's vast property, a detail from his journals leading them to the site. The full, horrifying scope of Crow's monstrous crimes was slowly, painstakingly being pieced together. Finally, Nurse Collins returned. "Father Vance, your sister is settled. You can see her now." "Just for a few minutes." Donning the cumbersome protective gear, Father Michael followed the nurse through a labyrinth of corridors to a quiet room in the intensive care unit. His heart hammered against his ribs. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath, steeling himself. The figure in the bed was barely recognizable as the vibrant young woman who had vanished 28 years ago. Serafina's hair, once a rich auburn, was now thin, white, and brittle. Her skin was pale and translucent, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. She was so frail, so diminished, she seemed almost ethereal. Yet, as her eyes, sunken but incredibly lucid, flickered open and found his, Father Michael saw it, the same inner light, the same unwavering spirit that had always defined his sister. It was a flame that even decades of darkness had failed to extinguish. "Michael," she whispered, her voice a dry, faint rasp, yet filled with an astonishing clarity. Her lips, cracked and pale, curved into the faintest of smiles. "Serafina," he choked out, tears streaming down his face, fogging his protective mask. He reached out, his gloved hand gently taking her small, bird-like one. It felt impossibly fragile. "Oh, Serafina, I found you. I never stopped looking, never stopped praying." "I knew," she whispered, her eyes holding his. "I knew you wouldn't. I told Beatrice, I told them all, God would not abandon us. He would send you." Her gaze was steady, her faith an almost palpable force in the sterile room. "I'm so sorry, Tess," he said, using her childhood nickname, his voice breaking. "So sorry it took so long." A faint shake of her head. "God's time, Michael. Always perfect." Her grip, though weak, tightened on his hand. Nurse Collins gently touched his arm. "Father, I'm sorry. Just a few more moments." He nodded, his heart aching at the brevity of this long-awaited reunion. "I'll be right outside, Serafina. I won't leave the hospital. We have so much to talk about. When you're stronger, tell me," she whispered, her eyes searching his, a flicker of urgent concern in their depths. "The church, our St. Michael's, is it still strong? Are the people keeping the faith?" Father Michael stared at her, momentarily stunned. After all she had endured, her first thoughts were not for herself, but for the spiritual well-being of the community, for the institution to which she had dedicated her stolen life. A profound wave of awe, of humility, washed over him. He smiled beneath his mask, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Serafina, the church is still strong. The gates of hell have not prevailed against it." He quoted Christ's promise from the Gospel of Matthew, a promise that now resonated with a power he had never fully grasped before. "The people of Havenwood, they remember you. They pray for you still, and their faith, like yours, endures." A look of deep, serene peace settled on Serafina's ravaged features. "Good," she whispered, her eyelids fluttering. "That is, good. Rest now, sister," he said softly, leaning closer. "God is with you, and so am I, always." As he stepped out of the ICU room, stripping off the protective gear, Father Michael felt as though he had just witnessed a miracle not just of survival, but of unwavering, transcendent faith. The darkness had been profound, the suffering unimaginable, but the light of his sister's spirit, her unyielding devotion, had shone through it all. The days that followed were a slow, arduous journey. Serafina's recovery was precarious, fraught with setbacks and small victories. Father Michael rarely left her side, keeping a quiet vigil, reading to her from the Psalms, praying with her when she had the strength. The story of the Havenwood nuns, as the media quickly dubbed them, captivated the nation, a horrifying tale of evil and an inspiring story of resilience. Alistair Crowe, silent and unrepentant, faced a litany of charges, his carefully constructed world of wealth and secrecy irrevocably shattered. Havenwood, once a town defined by a lingering, unanswered grief, now found itself at the center of a different kind of attention, one of awe, of sorrow, and of a renewed, if somber, faith. The community rallied around Sister Serafina, their prayers and support a tangible comfort. It would be a long road to healing, for Serafina, for Father Michael, for Havenwood itself. The scars of those 28 years were too deep to ever fully disappear. But as Father Michael sat by his sister's bedside, watching the first tentative rays of dawn touch her face, he knew that the long night was finally over. The Whispering Woods had yielded their secrets, the chamber of lost souls had been breached, and in the frail, battered body of Sister Serafina Vance, the enduring, unconquerable light of the human spirit, fortified by an unshakable faith, had triumphed over a darkness more profound than any he had ever imagined. The silence had been broken, and in its place, however faintly at first, a song of hope, of resilience, and of miraculous hard-won peace was beginning to be heard.